It's always bugged me that regenerative is portrayed as a win-win-win system for the farmer, the soil, and the planet. Farmers that don't do it can seem as if they're farming in a backwards way. However, if it were so simple and did so much, I'm sure they'd be doing it anyways. The overall theme of regenerative agriculture news this month is deflating the hype from some of the practices. It's not to say that they aren't worth it, but it's not all blue skies and roses. Stay tuned, I'll cover this in the upcoming episode. So welcome to Plants Dig Soil. My name is Scott Gillespie, and I work with farmers and agribusiness on climate-smart agriculture. This kind of agriculture has to be scientifically proven to be good for the planet now and in the future. Just as importantly, it also must make economic sense for the farmer, both now and in the future. Go to my website, www.plantsdigsoil.com, or check the links in the description to learn more about the services that I offer. Let's start with multi-paddock grazing. The traditional way to graze a pasture was to let the animals out and let them have free access to the entire area at once. This takes very little labor, and they can walk to the water source and to the feed whenever they want. The downside to this is that some areas, usually near the water sources, get grazed harder and more manure and urine gets deposited there. It would seem that this was similar to how the buffalo roamed the land in the past, but the key difference is that the buffalo would graze small areas intensively and move on. Sometimes these areas weren't touched again for years or maybe decades. So to simulate this, ranchers started using temporary fencing to mark off small areas from the graze in a short time period, and then move on to the next small area. The plants get a longer time to recover, and the manure is more evenly distributed. The downside to this is labor is needed for the frequent moving and fencing supplies, and the water systems that can service every little paddock, which are the little divisions within the system. As a non-animal person, I've always wondered how you make it work. If you watch a YouTube video, it seems simple. But how do you get all that grass to be just the right stage all the time? It turns out, as usual, it's not quite so simple. A long-term study running since 2014 has released, and its results show a 14% decline in animal gains using multi-paddock systems. They think it's because the nutritional quality isn't always there. You get it most of the time, but not always, and the declines will add up. The criticism of this study will be that the real-world ranchers will make it work, and that the academics don't know what they're doing. However, they were sure to have ranchers, government officials, and conservation groups all there to try to make it work. If you want to know more, check out the article in the links and read it. And if you really want to go in depth, they have a journal article. Now, you probably may counter that there's a benefit to the land and carbon sequestration. That hasn't been published yet, but they gave some early indications. Don't hold your breath. Even if it does sequester more carbon, it shows that there's always a cost. Building the soil isn't a free thing that farmers have been wasting over the years. There's always a trade-off. While on the topic of carbon sequestration, I'll link to a couple articles that cover the history of carbon sequestration and some of the new investigative journalism that's showing that many of the credits that are purported to have sequestered carbon couldn't be substantiated. Now, this means that the companies that bought them got to say that they're carbon neutral and nothing really happened in the real world. The companies may be seen as the victims here too, unless they knew it all along and just wanted to go along with the publicity. This relates to the fear that I talked about in the Future Ecologies episode 4.8, Ground Truthing. We need to slow down and be sure these are real before just jumping onto them. Another practice coming to Canada is tree intercropping. There's promise for this to work in the areas of Canada that naturally have trees, but I don't think we should just be trying to impose this on geography that is naturally grasslands. Here in the prairies, prairie strips would be the more appropriate intercrop. However, with both, there's a cost. If you put 10 to 30% of the land in things that are not cash crops, then you must use more land. There will be yield gains, but they don't line up with the land lost. Like I said at the beginning, if farmers found that by taking out tree lines, they lost yield, they would have put them back in. In fact, when taking these areas out, they gained. If society wants farmers to use these practices for climate-smart agriculture, it needs to pay them. This point is stressed in an article about cover crops. They have a nice infographic to cover the costs and the benefits. Leaving a cover crop longer has more ecosystem services, but it risks lowering the crop yield. Terminating it early may maximize the benefits for the farmer, but not so much for carbon buildup. I don't want to make the whole episode about how nothing is working, so here's where I think the practices fit in. They must solve a problem. Dr. Brianne Tidman puts herbicide-tolerant crops in context in an article in the Western Producer. They're not the future of weed control, but they're also not something to demonize. A good crop rotation and the use of cover crops can help them to work better. United States farmers that have had the most success with cover crops have been using them to suppress weeds. They don't usually replace herbicides, but the cost of the cover crop is less than the additional herbicides needed. Another regenerative practice that I think is worth spending time on is trap cropping. Dr. Megan Vankowski has planted peas along the edges of pulse crops to attract the pea leaf weevil adults in the fall when they come out for a bite to eat before overwintering. If many growers in a region did this, there's potential that we could lure them away with trap crops and kill them with insecticides or predators. The research is just underway, so there's no results yet, but the proof of concept trial shows there's potential. Dr. Judith Naranzia has been working on potatoes and cover crops for years in Prince Edward Island and has been able to measure less soil erosion where they are used. They're also able to pick up nutrients and may be able to suppress pests. This works in the humid, long-season area on the coast of the country, but in our area, the Prairies, establishment still remains the biggest hurdle. However, it's nice to see numbers to practices rather than just anecdotes. I'll finish with a few articles about innovation. The first is about the explosion of biologicals onto the market. There's an excellent article by an agronomist talking about his experiences trying to bring new products to the market in a former job. The lab test showed results. The products did work. However, no matter what formulation or timing they tried, they couldn't get them to work in the field. He then describes a protocol you can follow to test on the farm. Don't take the sales rep's word for it. Test it. Oftentimes they've bought into it too. They go off the scientist's results and believe that it works. The only way to know is to test. And finally, a really fascinating idea from one of the driest areas of southern Alberta. A company is trying to seed cover crops in dry soil by using fertilizer as a carrier. The idea seems to be that if you can get the seed to germinate, it will find the moisture. It sounds like this idea has been tried for years, and they feel they're close. I'll be keeping an eye on this. Thanks for tuning in, and I will talk to you next week.